For this lesson, we need to look at some of the terms that are essential to understanding evolution. In the previous lesson, we talked about the evidence of evolution, and now we're going to examine the actual process by which something would evolve. So remember, common misconception is that evolution occurs from one generation to the next. In reality, evolution is a complex process that occurs over time. The other thing I need you to remember and keep in the forefront of your mind is that the likelihood of an organism to evolve is determined not by the organism but by the environment. So when we say something was selected for, we're talking about the idea that the environment makes one organism more favorable to another because of a trait that they might have. Okay, so I want to talk real quickly, real briefly about this idea of artificial selection before we move into the process of natural selection, which is really what our focus is. We can artificially select for things. So this would be the idea like genetically modified food or selecting for a specific breed of dog. So there might be traits or characteristics in a dog that we would see. When we selectively breed organisms, whether that be plant or animal, what we're saying is we want a specific trait and we're going to breed them in a way that produces that trait. So we start here and we move here with a specific trait in mind. Okay, this is different than evolution. It can cause the change of a species, but it happens much more quickly and in a more artificial way than we see with natural selection. So let's look at some of the ideas of natural selection, and then we're going to define a few other terms before you work on your project with your partner. So natural selection, you'll also hear the term survival of the fittest. The fittest doesn't mean the most athletic, doesn't mean the skinniest or the prettiest. The fittest in the case of biology is strictly referring to how an organism is best suited to survive in the environment that they live in. If an organism is suited to survive, then they will. And if they have traits that are not favorable to the environment, then they won't survive, they'll die. Okay? So this is a mechanism that's proposed by Charles Darwin. He is credited for really propelling the theory of evolution. He wasn't the first one to think about the theory of evolution, but the one that has propelled that. And we have talked about him, looked at some of his work previously. So let's look at a few methods quickly for, or principles of natural selection. Okay, so the first is variation. Variation tells us that genetics dictate that individuals will vary among a population. And this is what we talked about when we talked about meiosis. Crossing over genetic variation. Even you from your siblings or your cousins are going to see genetic variation. So organisms will differ amongst a population. Organisms can vary in their appearance and still be members of the same species because that's what a population is. A population consists of members of the same species. So when we look at this picture in the top corner with the mice, those are all mice. They're all of the same species. That means they can breed with each other and produce offspring. However, you see kind of in the middle, there's a white mouse and there's another white mouse up in the top corner. With the white background, those two are much more camouflaged. Now think about the idea of a predator flying over top. When the predator flies over, they're going to see the black mouse, they're going to see the dark brown mouse, and then the lighter brown mice. They are not going to see as easily, if it's a white background, the white mice. So variation is going to be one method by which we lead to, or we see species led to natural selection. The white mouse in this case would survive if they were, let's say, in a tundra, would be the most likely to survive, or if it snowed because they're white. However, if they're in a dark, like a black dirt kind of environment, the darker mouse is going to survive and the white mouse would stand out. So variation is one thing that would eventually lead to natural selection within a species. The next idea is the idea of heritability. This is the idea that we inherit traits from our parents. So, plain and simply put, we can't inherit a trait if our parent doesn't have that trait to give to us. Now, we need to remember our study of genetics, and we need to remember the difference between a genotype and a phenotype, and the idea of genes being turned off and genes being turned on. So, there may be a trait that our parents would contain that we don't see just by looking at them. However, the traits that we receive come from our parents. Okay, so variation traits are inherited from parent to offspring, and those traits that are passed down lead to evolution of a species over time through natural selection. So if the trait's good, they'll pass it down. They didn't die, they had a good trait, they didn't die, they passed it down to their offspring. Okay, if the trait's bad and the organism can't survive, they won't be able to pass that trait down. Another concept, and this goes to, again, a concept that we learned earlier in the year, the R strategist versus the K strategist, is the idea of overproduction of offspring. So, simply put, organisms that produce more offspring, like the spiders or the tree, will be able to survive, because even if nature takes out a good portion of them, they will still have a lot of offspring left. And we've talked a lot about this idea. We can think about how this would lead to natural selection. And then there are many, many reproductive advantages that organisms would have. So this would allow certain organisms to be more appealing to their mates. Some birds are really funny to study because some birds have like a fancy dance, and they would dance around and shake their feathers and attract a mate that way. It's also interesting to note that in nature, oftentimes it's the male of the species that's the more ornate, decorative. The peacock, for example, you see a male peacock with the large tail feathers. In humans, we often put a lot of pressure, societal pressure, on the women to be the more ornate, to gain the reproductive advantage, when really in nature it's the male that has the job of attracting that mate, and in order to do that they need to be able to attract them with either markings or a ritual or a habitat, as you can see with the other bird here and the bottle caps. He's making an attractive nest. So those four concepts help lead to this idea of natural selection. Depending on which you're looking at, we can think about how these would lead to advantages that would allow one trait within a species to be passed from parent to offspring. I'm going to skip through this because we've already learned this, and I just want to talk about one other slide. Sorry guys, that is right here. Okay, so this is the last kind of thing I want to talk about. Remember, an adaptation is a trait that has been shaped by natural selection. So it's all related to what the environment says is the best trait to survive. Once we see the best trait, or the environment determines the best trait, that will be passed from organism to offspring. And that is the definition of fitness. Not how muscular, not how toned, not how skinny, but can this organism reproduce and pass that trait on? If the answer is yes, we would say they've been selected, they are fit. The more that occurs, the greater the adaptation is within the environment, the more fit we would consider a species, because the more they would be able to reproduce and pass that trait on from one species to another. We know that there's several types of adaptation. There's camouflage adaptation. So if an organism blends with the environment, that's what I was talking about with the mice, that would be one adaptation that would give them an evolutionary advantage. There we would see this idea of natural selection. The organism that blends can hide from predators, or hide and be more able to get prey. Here's another example of camouflage. You see the fish right in the middle. If you are a larger fish swimming by, you're probably not going to notice that small fish, and then you're not going to be able to eat them. So here's how natural selection works. This trait is favorable to the environment. Now this fish can survive and reproduce. That means they're the fittest. Here we see the lizard. Again, to us that might be noticeable, but to a predator, a bird flying overhead, that really would blend in very well. Okay. Mimicry is another one. So when we think about mimicry, there's a mimic octopus that's really great at doing this. They can resemble many different things, and in doing so they're scaring off predators or making something think that they are harmless when they're making something think that they're harmful when they're actually harmless. This would allow predators or encourage predators to avoid them. So we see that with the monarch butterfly and then the mimic of that. We also see that with the poison versus the non-poisoned dart frogs. And then snakes are really good at this. We see poisonous versus non-poisonous snake. At a quick glance, you're not really going to notice the difference. And that is all that I have for you for this lesson. Make sure that you follow the instructions in terms of discussing and sharing your notes with your partner. And look at the project where you will be selecting different organisms, picking their most prominent traits, and thinking about how those adaptations have allowed them to be successful in their environment. I have included an example of that for you. Make sure you ask if you have any questions, but remember this is a partner activity. It starts with your notes from this, so you'll want to share those with your partner, and then move forward to looking at the traits from various organisms of your choice. Make sure you're diverse in your biome selection because that will help set you up for your final assignment in this class. Thanks, guys.